Welcome to episode 9 of Rise of a Nation, South America. This episode is on Chile.
Welcome to the deep dive, your ultimate shortcut to becoming truly well-informed, without ever feeling buried by information. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey through Chile's past, a history that's, well, as rich and complex as its geography is long and thin. We're going to unpack centuries of transformation, from its earliest colonial encounters right up to a pivotal and, frankly, highly controversial military dictatorship that reshaped the nation.
That's right. We've pulled together a really interesting stack of sources for this deep dive. Everything from old historical chronicles to more modern analyses. Our mission isn't just to tell you what happened, but to really extract those surprising, maybe non-obvious insights and those aha moments, to give you a truly comprehensive understanding of Chile's unique path without any of the textbook overload.
Okay, let's dive in then. Our goal today is to trace Chile's distinct path, understanding how different eras built upon and sometimes, dramatically clashed with each other, leading to profound and often pretty unexpected impacts on its people, its politics. It's a story of incredible resilience, I think, and the power of natural resources and, moments of radical, even shocking shifts. Colonial foundations, a long, thin slice of Spanish America. Okay, so our journey begins with Europe's first contact. Now, while Ferdinand Magellan sailed through Chilean territory way back in 1520, the official discoverer is usually considered Diego de Almagro. He arrived in central Chile in 1537, but he was famously unimpressed.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Unlike the legendary silver mines of Pocosi up in Peru, he found very little gold or silver. And he noted the poor inhabitants, apparently, and pretty quickly headed back north. Not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Right, and this early perception, it isn't just some historical footnote, is it? It really shaped Chile's colonial development.
Oh, profoundly. Unlike those gold-rich centers of the Spanish Empire, Chile was initially, relegated to a peripheral economic role, sort of secondary. But what's truly fascinating, and this is a theme you see echoing throughout Chile's history, is the fierce resistance of the Mapuche people.
Ah, yes, the indigenous inhabitants.
Exactly. In central and southern Chile, they successfully resisted both Inca expansion and later, the Spanish conquest. It really set a tone of enduring defiance against external powers that you see pop up again and again.
So given that initial lack of, let's say, dazzling resources, how did the Spanish actually manage to establish a foothold? And, what unforeseen challenges did that unique geography present? It must have forced them to adapt differently than, say, in Peru.
Well, they were compelled to pivot, really. There was a major indigenous uprising around 1598, a huge setback. It led to the collapse of their southern cities and the loss of gold districts and, crucially, their largest indigenous labor sources. So the colony's economy just had to dramatically shift. The focus moved northward to the Central Valley.
Right. And connecting this to the bigger picture, it wasn't just a pivot for survival, was it? It sounds like a complete reimagining of Chile's economic identity within the empire.
Absolutely. The economy transitioned from mining, which hadn't panned out, to agriculture and husbandry, raising animals. This era, particularly the 17th century, actually earned the nickname the Century of Suet.
Suet, like fat.
Yeah, exactly. Because of the huge exports of animal products like suet, charqui, that's like dried beef, staple, and leather, mostly to Peru. Then later, in the 18th century, Chile became a significant exporter of wheat, again, mainly to Peru, especially after a big earthquake in 1687 and a stem rust epidemic really crippled Peruvian production.
Ah, okay. So Chile stepped into the gap.
It did. This truly cemented Chile's emergence as a key agricultural provider for the region, a major shift from those early expectations.
And socially, things were changing too. You mentioned a unique blend developing.
Yes, there was a significant migration of Basque people from Spain. They mingled with the existing landowning criollos. Those are people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. And together they formed a new, powerful upper class. And interestingly, sources note that marriage fidelity among Spaniards in Chile also seems to have increased over the centuries, reflecting maybe broader societal shifts, Catholic reforms.
And what about external threats? It's a long coastline.
A very long, vulnerable coastline. The Spanish invested heavily in fortifying it, most notably the Valdivian fort system down south. That was rebuilt after a brief Dutch occupation in 1643. There were persistent fears of English and Dutch incursions, pirates too. It highlights Chile's strategic, but definitely vulnerable position at the far edge of the empire. It really underscores how these global power struggles played out, even in what seemed like a distant corner of the world. 2. the tumult of independence and early republic.
Okay, so the stage was set for centuries of Spanish rule, but what exactly triggered the break? The move for independence. It wasn't straightforward, was it?
Not at all. The initial spark, you could say, was Napoleon's usurpation of the Spanish throne back in 1810. That destabilized everything. But in Chile, it quickly devolved into a bitter civil conflict, really within the Chilean elite itself. You had the pro-independence criollos fighting against royalist criollos who wanted to stick with Spain.
So not a unified front against the Spanish crown, but Chilean versus Chilean.
Exactly. And this internal division proved incredibly costly.
This internal struggle seems absolutely crucial to understanding Chile's path forward. You had figures like José Miguel Carrera and Bernardo O'Higgins, both independentists.
Both ardent independentists, yes. But they led rival factions. There was serious infighting, what historians call internecine strife. And this disunity, well, it played right into the hands of the Spanish.
Allowing them to come back in.
Precisely. Spanish troops loyal to the crown, mostly coming from Peru, took advantage of the chaos and reconquered Chile by 1814. This led to a harsh period known as the Reconquista, the Reconquest. But, this brutal Spanish re-rule only intensified the desire for full independence among more and more Chileans. It backfired in a way.
So O'Higgins, he was exiled in Argentina.
He was, and there he joined forces with José de San Martín, the famous Argentinian general. Their combined army mounted this incredibly daring assault over the Andes in 1817, a legendary crossing. Their victory at the Battle of Chacabuco marked the beginning of what they called the Patria Nueva, the new fatherland.
And San Martín, his goal wasn't just Chile, right? He saw it as a stepping stone.
That's right. He viewed Chile's liberation as strategically essential for the ultimate goal, the emancipation of Peru, which he saw as the royalist stronghold. Chile won its formal independence at the Battle of Maipú in 1818. That was the decisive blow against the main Spanish force. Yet, pockets of royalist resistance, especially in the south, actually continued until 1826. And Spain itself didn't officially recognize Chile's independence until 1840.
So independence achieved, but stability, that was
a much harder story. Post-independence Chile really struggled. O'Higgins himself, despite his key role, alienated many with his authoritarian style and anti-clerical policies. That led to his exile in 1823. The 1820s then saw this rapid turnover of presidents, different constitutions. It was marked by civil conflict, a really turbulent decade, until finally the conservatives seized control in 1830.
Okay, the conservative era. And this brings us to Diego Portales. He looms large, doesn't he? Even though he was never actually president.
He looms very large. Portales was the dominant figure. He centralized authority and established what's often termed an autocratic republic. It's almost like he built this republican facade, but underneath it was a deeply centralized, almost monarchical power structure in practice.
More power than some actual kings, maybe?
You could argue that. This system was institutionalized by the Chilean Constitution of 1833. And get this, it became one of the most durable charters in Latin American history, lasting all the way until 1925. It concentrated immense power in the presidency. Presidents could serve 2 consecutive 5-year terms and even pick their successor. Portales achieved his aims through dictatorial powers, strict press censorship, manipulating elections, basically creating an autocratic system under a Republican veneer. It was a stark blueprint. Stability, yes, but at the cost of genuine democratic participation. Third, the War of the Pacific, a battle for resources and hegemony.
So this strong, centralized state, forged in that conservative era, it would soon face, its greatest test, wouldn't it? The mid-19th century brings us to a conflict that fundamentally reshaped Chile and the entire region, the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884. And this was primarily a war over resources, right? Though territory was the immediate trigger.
Indeed. The core dispute was over these vast nitrate deposits in the Atacama Desert. Nitrates were hugely valuable then for fertilizer and explosives. At the time, the richest deposits were located in coastal Bolivian territory. Bolivia had increased taxes on a Chilean mining company operating there, which Chile argued violated an 1874 treaty. Chile protested, but when Bolivia seized the company's assets as punishment, Chile occupied the port city of Antofagasta in February 1879.
And that was Bolivian territory at the time.
It was. Bolivia declared war on March 1st, and then Peru got drawn in.
Because of a secret alliance with Bolivia.
Exactly. The secret defensive alliance signed back in 1873. So Chile declared war on Peru as well on April 5th.
So, okay, the trigger was taxes and treaties, but what were the deeper currents pulling these nations into such a devastating war? It feels like there must have been more to it.
Oh, absolutely. This raises that important question. What were the underlying causes? Historians point to several factors. First, both Chile and Peru had intense interests in the lucrative nitrate business itself. Big money involved. Second, there was this long-standing rivalry between Chile and Peru for regional hegemony, for dominance in the southeastern Pacific. And third, critically, you had these stark political and economic disparities. Chile was relatively stable, politically and economically progressing. Peru and Bolivia, on the other hand, were plagued by chronic instability and, frankly, poor governance. Some observers at the time, and even some historians later, argued the war was almost inevitable, a collision course.
Driven by resources, ambition, and maybe Chile's relative strength.
Chile's military readiness definitely gave them a significant advantage right from the start. They had educated officers, professional soldiers, many with experience from fighting the Mapuche, and, crucially, modern uniform arms. And their navy, especially with 2 new British-built ironclads, completely outmatched Peru's older, more obsolete fleet. Naval power was key.
Preparedness matters.
Hugely. After gaining naval supremacy by October 1879, Chile launched its land campaign. They focused on occupying Peru's Tarapacá province, which was also rich in saltpeter, those nitrates. The war was incredibly brutal and devastating. After the battles of Chorrillos and Miraflores just outside Lima in January 1881, the capital of Peru itself was occupied by Chilean forces.
Occupying the enemy capital, that's significant.
Extremely. And reports from the time describe widespread looting. What's shocking is that it apparently began even by Peruvians themselves before the Chileans entered Lima. A kind of desperate scramble, perhaps reflecting the breakdown of order and the sheer desperation of the situation. It really underscored the chaos and the psychological toll, paving the way for Chile's decisive but definitely scarring victory.
And those scars, they lasted, didn't they?
They did. The conflict left deep wounds and animosity between Peruvians and Chileans that, well, you can still sense sometimes today. And the outcome. Chile gained significant resource-rich territory from both Peru, Tarapacá, and Bolivia, the entire coastal province leaving Bolivia landlocked. It dramatically altered the regional map and cemented Chile's economic future, fueled by nitrate wealth for decades. 4. The Pinochet dictatorship. A shocking chapter.
Okay, so this newfound resource wealth, the nitrate boom, it didn't guarantee an era of just peace and stability, did it? Chile's entry into the 20th century seems to have ushered in new kinds of political struggle, social reform movements.
That's right. You see the rise of figures like Arturo Alessandri Palma, a reformist president who pioneered this new style of appealing directly to the masses, to the working class. Yet, political instability continued. There were military coups, even a de facto dictatorship under Carlos Ibáñez in the late 1920s. By the 1960s, you had the Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei Montalva initiating major social and economic reforms, like land redistribution. Things were changing, but tensions were high.
And this sets the stage for one of the most defining and certainly most controversial periods in Chilean history.
Absolutely. The presidency of Salvador Allende, elected in 1970. He was the first democratically elected Marxist head of state anywhere in Latin America. A huge moment. His government aimed for a really radical transformation of society. He described it not as communism, but as aiming for a sort of North European-style welfare state.
So higher incomes for the poor, free education.
Exactly. Increasing income for the poorest sectors, making all education, including universities, free. It was a very ambitious, sweeping vision for a Chilean road to socialism.
But, and this is fascinating, despite his clear democratic election, Allende very quickly became a target, didn't he? Particularly from outside Chile.
Immediately. The United States, under President Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, saw Allende's program as a major threat, especially his plan for mass nationalization and confiscation, particularly of the huge copper mines where U.S. companies like Anaconda and Kennecott had massive investments. And crucially, they feared the spread of Marxism in the Western Hemisphere during the height of the Cold War. Chile was seen as a potential domino.
So the U.S. actively worked against him.
Oh, yes, covertly and overtly. The U.S. tried to destabilize Allende's government. There's documented evidence of funding opposition media and politicians and imposing severe economic sanctions. The infamous order from Nixon to the CIA was apparently to make the Chilean economy scream. And this certainly contributed significantly to the economic crisis that developed within Chile, soaring inflation, severe shortages of basic goods. It fueled social unrest and polarization.
And this polarization, this crisis, it escalated dramatically.
It did, to the point of a military coup. On September 11th, 1973, a date etched into Chilean memory, the Chilean military, led by the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and police, moved against the government. There's strong evidence of U.S. financial and intelligence support for the coup plotters, though the extent is still debated. Allende himself died during the military's assault on La Moneda, the presidential palace. The circumstances are debated, but the official finding years later was suicide. General Augusto Pinochet, the head of the army, seized power, establishing an authoritarian military dictatorship that would last for 17 long years. A shocking rupture of Chile's long democratic tradition.
And this regime, it wasn't just authoritarian, it was brutal.
Brutal is the word. This raises a crucial question about the nature of the Pinochet regime. It was characterized by systematic repression. Civil liberties were abolished immediately, Congress was dissolved, political parties were banned, unions were outlawed or heavily controlled, thousands of people were killed or disappeared, abducted, tortured, and murdered, their bodies often hidden. Torture was widespread and systematic.
Horrific accounts from survivors.
Truly horrific. Survivors describe being held in makeshift concentration camps, like the National Stadium initially, or places like Tres Alamos and secret torture houses. One notorious one was known as Venda Sexy, the sexy blindfold, infamous for its systematic use of sexual violence alongside electric shocks, waterboarding, beatings. The regime systematically targeted anyone perceived as an opponent, leftists, activists, academics, artists, ensuring that fear permeated society.
But the Pinochet era, it wasn't just about this brutal political repression, was it? There was this parallel extreme economic experiment happening. How connected were those two?
They were completely intertwined, inseparable really. Pinochet implemented these drastic free market reforms, guided by a group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, hence the nickname the Chicago Boys. They were disciples of Milton Friedman and believed strongly in monetarism controlling the money supply, minimal government intervention. This was radical shock therapy for the Chilean economy. The goal was, essentially, to shrink the state to near invisibility.
Privatizing everything.
Pretty much. Pensions, education, healthcare were largely privatized. Public spending was drastically slashed, import tariffs were cut dramatically to force Chilean businesses to compete globally, and these radical economic policies went hand in hand with the political repression. You couldn't have one without the other, arguably. Trade unions were brutally suppressed. Why? To prevent any organized resistance to the consequences of these policies, like falling real wages and soaring unemployment, which hit 30% in 1975-76, Pinochet's Chile became this kind of laboratory for neoliberal ideas. In many ways, it was a generation ahead of the later Reagan and Thatcher revolutions in the U.S. and U.K.
And connecting this to the bigger international picture, despite all the international condemnation for the regime's horrific human rights abuses, Pinochet did find some powerful allies, didn't he?
He did. Most notably, perhaps surprisingly to some, Margaret Thatcher's government in the UK. There was a very specific reason. Chile provided crucial, though at the time secret, help to Britain during the 1982 Falklands War against Argentina. They provided vital intelligence, early warning radar data, and even allowed British Special Forces aircraft to operate covertly from Chilean territory.
Wow, that's a fascinating insight into the sort of pragmatism or maybe cynicism of international relations?
It absolutely is. This loyalty from Thatcher, born out of genuine gratitude for Chile's Falklands assistance, was quite strong. It even led Britain, reportedly, to try and water down international criticism of the Pinochet regime at the United Nations Human Rights Commission. It powerfully reveals how strategic interests, military alliances, can sometimes override concerns about widespread human rights violations on the global stage. Complex moral calculus.
So how did this long dictatorship finally end? It wasn't another revolution or coup, was it?
No. Somewhat unexpectedly, the beginning of the end came through a mechanism Pinochet himself created. A plebiscite held in 1988. He was confident it would grant him another 8 years in power, legitimizing his rule. Voters were asked simply yes or no to his continuation.
Oh, well, it didn't go his way.
Not at all. The opposition, fragmented for years, united behind a remarkably creative and optimistic no campaign. Their slogan was, La alegría ya viene, joy is coming. Despite Pinochet controlling the media and state resources, 55% of voters rejected his continuation in power, a stunning result. Although reports suggest Pinochet initially considered refusing to accept the result, significant pressure, including from the U.S., and crucially, from within parts of his own military, led to his isolation. He was forced to concede. It was a remarkable, largely peaceful transition away from dictatorship, driven by the ballot box.
And then elections followed.
Yes. In 1989, Patricio Aylwin, leading a center-left coalition, won the presidential elections. Democracy officially returned to Chile in March 1990. Pinochet, however, negotiated a deal where he remained commander-in-chief of the army until 1998 and then became a lifetime senator. So he cast this long, kind of unnerving shadow over Chile's transition back to democratic rule for many years. Outro.
Wow. We've really journeyed through centuries of Chilean history today, witnessing its unique struggles, for independence, those dramatic shifts in its economic identity, and the profound, often incredibly brutal impacts of political power. It's quite a story, a nation shaped by its unique land, its resilient people, but also powerfully by these global currents.
Absolutely. From that fierce indigenous resistance against the Spanish, through the internal conflicts of independence, the resource-driven wars like the War of the Pacific, right up to that chilling economic and social experiment under Pinochet. Chile's past is really a testament to both remarkable resilience and the enduring, sometimes devastating influence of external forces and internal divisions. And what's truly insightful, I think, is how these deep layers of history continue to inform Chile's present. You see it in its economic model, its political debates, its national identity.
So what does this all mean for you listening in? As you reflect on Chile's story, maybe consider how a nation's geography, that long, thin strip of land, its natural resources, whether it's copper or nitrates or lithium today, and the prevailing global political climate, like the Cold War, can converge to shape its destiny in ways that resonate for generations. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that history isn't just about dates and names locked in the past. It's this long, complex chain of cause and effect that shapes our present.
And perhaps the deepest dive of all, the one to really think about, is how societies like Chile's grapple with remembering and reconciling such difficult, traumatic pasts. What lessons do these experiences, the triumphs, the tragedies, the compromises, hold for the future of democracy, for human rights, and for that delicate, often fraught balance between state power and individual liberty, not just in Chile, but really everywhere around the world today?
Thank you for watching Episode 9 of Rise of a Nation, South America. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's rise you would like me to cover next.